The metallic click of the Morphine cigarette's wire loop breaking the seal echoed strangely loud in Private First-Class Macarius Donati's ears, despite the artillery barrage raining down just 300 yards ahead. It was April 16th, 1944, and dawn was breaking over the Rapido Valley in central Italy. The 27th Medical Battalion's young combat medic steadied his hand as he prepared the injection, not for a wounded American soldier, but for a captured German Oberleutnant who sat propped against a bombed-out farmhouse wall, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. Blood oozed from a shrapnel wound in the officer's thigh, but it wasn't life-threatening. What made this scene extraordinary was the 17 other Wehrmacht officers lined up nearby, all with minor injuries, all watching Donati work with wary, suspicious eyes. "Sie werden sich bald besser fühlen," Donati murmured in accented German. "You'll feel better soon." As he administered the half-dose of morphine with practiced precision, his movements deliberate and reassuring. The German officer's eyes widened with momentary surprise, then gradually softened as the painkiller began its work. None of them knew that this seemingly routine act of battlefield mercy was actually the culmination of a daring, unauthorized plan that had been forming in Donati's mind for weeks. A plan born of desperation, ingenuity, and a peculiar insight into the human psyche that would alter the course of the Allied push toward Rome. Behind Donati, Lieutenant Colonel Harrington of the 36th Infantry Division watched with barely concealed disbelief. He had reluctantly authorized this unorthodox field operation only hours earlier, against his better judgment and direct orders from command. "Whatever you're doing, Donati," he had warned, "if this goes south, I never knew you." What no one in the U.S. Fifth Army realized that morning was that a single combat medic's improvised gambit would not only provide the intelligence breakthrough they desperately needed, but would ultimately save over 900 American lives in the bloody campaign ahead. No one in the valley could have predicted that by sundown, the intelligence gleaned from these 18 German officers would completely rewrite the Allies' understanding of enemy defenses below Monte Cassino. All because one medic chose to disobey conventional protocols and employ morphine not just as medicine, but as an instrument of war. Macarius Donati was born on March 7, 1922, in the small coal mining town of Madeira, Pennsylvania. The son of Italian immigrants, he grew up speaking both English and Italian at home, with a smattering of German learned from neighbors. His father, Giuseppe, had fled Mussolini's fascist regime in 1921, bringing with him deep-seated values of freedom and democracy that he instilled in his only son. Donati's mother, Maria, worked as a nurse at the local clinic, often bringing home stories of the miners she treated, men with crushed limbs, black lung and horrific burns. By the age of 12, young Macarius was helping his mother change dressings and administer basic treatments to neighbors who couldn't afford proper medical care. The Donati family lived modestly in a 2-room company house where education was prized above all else. Despite the Depression-era hardships, Giuseppe insisted his son stay in school, while many other boys dropped out to work in the mines. "Your mind is the one thing they can never take from you," Giuseppe would tell him in Italian, tapping his son's forehead with a coal-stained finger. This lesson in mental resilience would serve Macarius well in the years to come. In high school, Donati showed an unusual aptitude for chemistry and biology, conducting makeshift experiments in the family's kitchen to his mother's dismay. His teachers recognized his talent and encouraged him to pursue medicine, but college seemed financially impossible. Then in December 1941, as Donati was working as a pharmacy assistant and saving for community college, Pearl Harbor changed everything. "I remember exactly where I was," Donati would later write in letters home, "stacking aspirin bottles when the radio announcement came. By evening I knew what I had to do." He enlisted the following week, not out of a romantic notion of heroism, but with a pragmatic desire to put his medical interest to use. The recruitment officer, noting his background, recommended him for medical corps training. At Camp Pickett, Virginia, Donati's training revealed his exceptional calm under pressure. While other trainees hesitated during simulated battlefield scenarios, he moved with quiet efficiency that impressed his instructors. "Donati thinks 3 steps ahead," noted one evaluation, "shows unusual ingenuity in adapting medical protocols to field conditions." This adaptability would later become his defining characteristic as a combat medic. His training also exposed him to the Army's standard-issue morphine syrettes, small, toothpaste-like tubes with attached needles containing a single dose of morphine tartrate. These were revolutionary for battlefield medicine, allowing quick pain relief without complex equipment. Donati became particularly interested in how different patients responded to morphine, noting variations that few other medics seemed to observe. During advanced training, an incident occurred that would later inform his unorthodox approach in Italy. A drill instructor, simulating battlefield chaos, suddenly altered the scenario by declaring half the medical supplies destroyed. While other trainees faltered, Donati quickly improvised alternatives using available materials. "Medicine isn't about having everything you need," he explained afterward. "It's about making what you have work in ways nobody expected." This resourcefulness earned him both admiration and suspicion. While his commanders recognized his talent, some fellow trainees resented his unconventional approaches. One sergeant warned him, "The Army has protocols for a reason, Donati. Your clever ideas might get someone killed." He couldn't know how wrong that assessment would prove to be. By late 1943, Donati found himself assigned to the 27th Medical Battalion, supporting the 36th Infantry Division in the Italian campaign. As he boarded the transport ship in Newport News, Virginia, he carried with him not just his medical kit, but a conviction that rigid adherence to protocol wasn't always the path to saving lives. "I had no idea," he later confided to a fellow medic, "that this belief would soon be put to the ultimate test, with hundreds of lives hanging in the balance." By early 1944, the Allied campaign in Italy had bogged down into a grueling war of attrition. After successfully landing at Salerno in September 1943 and securing Naples, the Allied advance northward stalled before the formidable German Gustav Line, a series of interlocking defensive positions anchored by the historic monastery at Monte Cassino. This mountainous barrier effectively blocked the road to Rome, forcing Allied troops to fight for every blood-soaked yard of Italian soil. The Allied force, comprising American, British, Canadian, Free French, Polish, and other units, found itself locked in one of the most brutal campaigns of the European theatre. The terrain heavily favored the defenders, with German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring masterfully using the mountainous landscape to maximize his force's effectiveness. By February 1944, 4 major assaults against Monte Cassino had failed with catastrophic casualties. The U.S. Fifth Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mark Clark, bore the brunt of much of this fighting. Within this larger force, the 36th Infantry Division, to which Donati was attached, had already suffered grievously in a failed attempt to cross the Rapido River in January, losing over 2,000 men in just 2 days. The division was still recovering from this devastating action when it was recommitted to the line in April 1944. For the common soldier, the Italian front presented a miserable existence. Winter brought freezing rain and mud that transformed trenches into ice-water canals. Trench foot became as common as combat wounds. German artillery, precisely zeroed on all approach routes, made movement during daylight hours nearly suicidal. Resupply often depended on mule trains navigating treacherous mountain paths under cover of darkness. Combat medics like Donati faced unique challenges in this environment. The steep terrain made evacuating wounded extremely difficult, sometimes requiring 10 to 12 men to carry a single stretcher case down mountain trails. Aid stations were often miles behind the lines, meaning wounded men might wait hours for treatment. The standard practice of pinning a used morphine syrette to a wounded soldier's collar to prevent accidental overdose sometimes failed when men were wounded multiple times in separate incidents, leading to dangerous errors in treatment. Intelligence gathering proved equally challenging. The German forces maintained strict communication discipline, and prisoners of war were often low-ranking soldiers with limited knowledge of overall plans. Senior officers, if captured, typically remained silent beyond providing name, rank, and service number as required by the Geneva Convention. This information vacuum severely hampered Allied planning, particularly regarding the disposition of German reserves and artillery positions. By mid-April 1944, the Allied command was preparing yet another offensive aimed at breaking through to Rome. Critical to this plan was accurate intelligence about German defensive positions and reserve locations. Traditional reconnaissance had provided only fragments of the overall picture, and signals intelligence had been frustrated by German use of landlines rather than radio for sensitive communications. It was against this backdrop of stalled momentum, mounting casualties, and intelligence failures that Donati began to formulate his unconventional approach. The catalyst came on April 14th, when he treated a captured German radio operator with a minor shrapnel wound. While administering morphine, Donati noticed how the soldier's resistance to questioning seemed to soften as the drug took effect. Not enough to become completely uninhibited, but enough that the man began to speak more freely about his unit's movements prior to capture. Donati reported this observation to his immediate superior, Captain Lawrence Mercer, who initially dismissed it. "Interrogation is intelligence's job, not medical's," Mercer reminded him. "Just patch them up according to protocol and move on." But the seed of an idea had been planted, one that would soon germinate into a plan that would change the course of the Italian campaign in ways no one could anticipate. The weather had turned unseasonably cold for mid-April, as Donati made his way through the forward aid station, checking supplies for the coming offensive. Rain lashed against the canvas tent, creating a steady drumbeat overhead as medics organized bandages, plasma, and the precious morphine syrettes that were always in high demand. Each morphine tube contained half a grain, approximately 30 milligrams, of morphine tartrate, enough to significantly dull pain, but also enough to potentially impair judgment and loosen inhibitions. Military protocol dictated that morphine be administered only for significant pain, typically from combat wounds, with the empty syrette then pinned to the soldier's collar to prevent accidental overdose by medical personnel further down the evacuation chain. Donati had been quietly observing the effects of morphine on various patients, noting something that wasn't in any medical manual. While the drug's primary purpose was pain relief, he had detected subtle differences in how it affected patients mentally, depending on the dosage, injection site, and individual physiology. Some became completely sedated, while others entered a more talkative, uninhibited state, where they seemed more willing to share information they might otherwise withhold. "We're running short on plasma again," remarked Sergeant Wilkins, the supply NCO, breaking into Donati's thoughts. "But we've got a surplus of morphine after that last resupply. Brass must be expecting heavy casualties." Donati nodded absently, his mind working through calculations and possibilities. He had recently learned that a German field headquarters had been established somewhere near their sector, suggesting the presence of high-ranking officers who would have comprehensive knowledge of enemy dispositions, exactly the intelligence the Allied command desperately needed. That evening, as rain continued to pound the tent, Donati approached Captain Mercer again, this time with a more developed proposal. "Sir, I think I've found a way to get the intelligence G2 has been asking for," he began cautiously. "It involves morphine, but not exactly how we're supposed to use it." Mercer's expression darkened. "Donati, we've been through this. Medical doesn't do intelligence work. With respect, sir, this isn't about changing our job. It's about recognizing an opportunity." Donati outlined his observation that certain doses of morphine, smaller than those typically used for severe pain, seemed to create a state where patients remained coherent but became more talkative and less guarded. If we had access to enemy officers, and if they had minor wounds requiring treatment. "You're talking about using medical treatment as an intelligence-gathering tool," Mercer interrupted, his voice lowered. "That's not just against protocol, Donati. It might violate the Geneva Convention." "Not if we're legitimately treating actual wounds, sir," Donati countered. "I'm not suggesting we administer anything unnecessary, just that we pay attention to what happens afterward and perhaps ensure that the right people are present." The captain stared at him for a long moment. "Put together something in writing. Specifics, protocols, safeguards. I'll think about it." As Donati turned to leave, Mercer added, "And Donati, keep this between us for now. If it goes nowhere, I don't want the men thinking medical is turning into spies. Over the next day, Donati meticulously documented his observations and developed precise guidelines for what he called enhanced therapeutic interviewing. He specified exact dosages, typically half the standard morphine syringe, calibrated to provide pain relief without full sedation. He included detailed notes on optimal timing for questioning after administration and emphasized that only actually wounded personnel would receive treatment. When he presented the document to Captain Mercer, the officer read it twice before speaking. "This is still highly irregular, Donati, but I can't deny we're desperate for better intelligence." He sighed heavily. "I'll take it up the chain, but don't get your hopes up. This kind of innovation isn't exactly what the Army encourages from field medics." 3 days passed with no response, and Donati assumed his proposal had been rejected. Then, on the evening of April 15th, he was summoned to a meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Harrington, the division's senior medical officer, and Major Wilson from G2 Intelligence. "Private Donati," Harrington began, his tone carefully neutral. "Your proposal has generated considerable discussion. Most of my colleagues consider it inappropriate at best, potentially criminal at worst." He paused, exchanging glances with Wilson. "However, we've just received intelligence that a German command vehicle was damaged by artillery near Hill 256. There may be wounded officers. Given our current intelligence deficit, Major Wilson has convinced me to authorize a limited trial of your approach." The parameters were strict. Donati would accompany a patrol to the area where the German vehicle had been reported. If officers were found wounded, he would provide legitimate medical treatment. Intelligence officers would be present, but Donati would lead the medical interactions. The entire operation would remain off the official record. "To be absolutely clear," Harrington emphasized, "this is not sanctioned by Division Command. If anything goes wrong, if there's even a hint of impropriety, I will personally see you court-martialed. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Donati replied, understanding both what was being said and what wasn't. He was being given the chance to prove his theory, but also being set up as the scapegoat if it failed. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential value of the intelligence that might be gained. That night, as Donati prepared his medical kit with extra care, selecting specific syringes and organizing his supplies, he felt the weight of what lay ahead. He was about to deliberately bend, if not break, established medical protocols in a war zone. If he was wrong, his actions could not only end his military career, but potentially endanger lives. If he was right, however, the information gained might save countless American soldiers. As he finally lay down to sleep, the words of his father echoed in his mind. "Your mind is the one thing they can never take from you." Tomorrow he would discover if his mental gamble would pay off or destroy everything he had worked for. Dawn broke misty and cool over the Italian countryside as Donati moved forward with a 12-man patrol from the 36th Division's reconnaissance company. They advanced cautiously through a landscape shattered by war. Olive groves splintered by artillery, stone farmhouses reduced to rubble, and fields churned into lunar craters by bombing. The spring wildflowers that should have carpeted the hillsides were largely absent, as if nature itself had retreated from the violence of human conflict. Captain James Reeves, the patrol leader, raised his hand for a halt as they approached the reported location of the damaged German vehicle. Through binoculars, they could make out a half-track transport partially concealed in a shallow ravine about 300 yards ahead. Smoke no longer rose from the vehicle, suggesting it had been disabled for some time, but movement was visible nearby. "I count at least 10 personnel," Reeves whispered. "Some appear wounded. They've established a defensive position in that farmhouse ruin." He passed the binoculars to Major Wilson, the intelligence officer who had accompanied them. "Those are officers," Wilson confirmed, studying the distant figures. "The uniforms are distinct. We may have stumbled onto something significant." He turned to Donati. "How do you want to proceed?" Donati took a deep breath, aware that everything now depended on his judgment. "We need to approach under a clear medical flag. I'll go in first with one assistant. Standard battlefield medical protocol would call for treating enemy wounded, if our forces have the capacity." Reeves looked skeptical. "And if they open fire?" "Then we withdraw and you handle it militarily," Donati replied evenly. But wounded men typically welcome medical assistance, regardless of uniform. After a brief discussion, the plan was approved. Donati and a corporal named Rodriguez would advance openly under a medical flag, while the rest of the patrol established covered positions to provide support if needed. Donati carefully selected the contents of his aid bag, ensuring he had the precisely prepared morphine syrettes he had modified for his purpose, each containing a carefully calibrated dose that his observations suggested would provide pain relief while potentially lowering inhibitions without causing excessive sedation. As they began their approach, Donati felt his heart hammering against his ribs. This was far beyond anything covered in his training. He was about to put theory into practice with the lives of his fellow soldiers and potentially the success of the entire offensive hanging in the balance. "Sanitator! Medic!" he called out in both German and English as they came within earshot of the farmhouse. "We are medical personnel. We see you have wounded." There was a tense moment of silence before a voice called back in accented English, "Approach slowly. Hands visible." Donati and Rodriguez walked forward deliberately, medical bags clearly displayed, red crosses visible on their helmets. As they neared the farmhouse, the full situation became clear. 18 German officers of varying ranks were sheltering in the ruins. Their vehicle had been disabled by Allied artillery the previous evening, and several had sustained injuries. Most significant was the presence of an Oberst, a full colonel, who appeared to be the senior officer present. "We have wounded," the German lieutenant who had called to them stated flatly. "3 serious, others minor." Donati nodded professionally, suppressing the surge of excitement at what they had discovered. This was clearly a high-level command group, precisely the intelligence windfall they had hoped for. "We will treat your wounded," he replied in German, noting the surprise that flickered across the officer's face at his language skills. "Your serious cases may need evacuation to our medical facilities." The German colonel spoke sharply from where he sat nursing an injured arm. "We accept treatment, but no one leaves. We are not surrendering." Donati began assessing the wounded, starting with the most serious cases, a captain with a chest wound that appeared relatively minor but would require monitoring, and 2 lieutenants with shrapnel injuries. As he worked, he maintained a calm, professional demeanor while taking mental note of snippets of conversation between the officers, many of whom assumed he couldn't understand their German discussions. When he reached the first officer requiring pain management, Donati made his move. "This will help with the pain," he explained in German as he prepared the syrette. "A small dose of morphine. You will remain alert." He administered the injection with practiced precision, then continued his treatment, cleaning and bandaging the wound while engaging the officer in seemingly casual conversation about his injury. "When were you injured?" Donati asked in German. "Last night during the barrage?" "Yes," the officer replied, his expression becoming slightly more relaxed as the morphine began to take effect. "We were returning from the command briefing at division headquarters when your artillery found us." "That's unfortunate timing," Donati sympathized, carefully monitoring the officer's responses. "Division headquarters must be quite busy preparing for what's coming." "Non-stop activity," the officer confirmed, his voice loosening slightly. "The general believes your forces will attempt another crossing at the same location as January. The defenses have been reinforced accordingly." This was exactly the type of information the Allied command needed. Confirmation that the Germans were expecting an attack at the previous crossing point, which meant the planned alternative crossing might achieve surprise. Donati continued his treatment, moving from officer to officer, administering the carefully prepared morphine doses to those who legitimately required pain management while maintaining a stream of seemingly innocent conversation. As the morning progressed, the atmosphere in the farmhouse gradually shifted. The initial tension eased as Donati and Rodriguez provided competent medical care. The German officers, experiencing the mild euphoria and lowered inhibitions that came with the precisely calculated morphine doses, began speaking more freely. Some discussed upcoming troop movements. Others mentioned reserve positions and artillery coordinates. One major, responding to Donati's casual question about supply challenges, revealed the location of a major ammunition depot that Allied intelligence had been attempting to locate for weeks. Major Wilson, who had joined them after the initial contact was secured, listened in growing amazement as Donati's unorthodox approach yielded an intelligence bonanza. The medic never asked direct military questions, never pressed for information that would violate the officer's military duty. Instead, he created an environment where the wounded men, experiencing relief from pain and the mild disinhibition of precisely dosed morphine, voluntarily shared information they would normally protect. By mid-morning, it became clear to both sides that the German position was untenable. With their vehicle destroyed and several wounded requiring more advanced care, the reality of captivity was setting in. The German colonel, himself now treated for his arm injury, finally made the decision. "We will accompany you to your medical facilities," he announced stiffly. "Under protest and only due to our medical situation. Please record that we did not surrender, but were compelled by circumstances to accept medical evacuation." As the prisoners were prepared for movement, Major Wilson pulled Donati aside. "I've been in intelligence for 3 years," he said quietly, "and I've never seen anything like this. The information these men have provided, casually, voluntarily, is precisely what we've been trying and failing to get for months. If this checks out." He shook his head in amazement. "How did you know this would work?" Donati shrugged modestly. "Observation. Different patients respond differently to morphine. I just noticed a pattern and thought it might be useful." He hesitated before adding, "Sir, none of these men were given anything they didn't medically need. The dosages were therapeutic." Wilson nodded. "I saw your work. Everything was by the book medically. It's just that no one ever thought to use the book this way." As they began the journey back to American lines with their 18 prisoners, Donati felt a complex mixture of emotions: professional satisfaction at having provided proper medical care, vindication that his theory had proved correct, but also uneasiness about the ethical boundaries he had navigated. He had not violated the letter of medical protocols, but he had certainly operated in a grey area that many would question. What he couldn't yet know was how the intelligence gleaned from this unorthodox operation would reshape the coming offensive, potentially saving hundreds, if not thousands, of American lives. Nor could he know how his actions this day would be viewed by military historians and medical ethicists for decades to come, as either a brilliant field innovation or a troubling precedent in the intersection of medicine and military intelligence. The 18 German officers were transported to the division rear area, where more extensive medical treatment was provided for those who needed it. More significantly, they were systematically debriefed by intelligence officers, who now had the advantage of knowing exactly what information the officers possessed, thanks to their unguarded conversations during Donati's treatment. The intelligence windfall proved even more valuable than initially expected. The officers, being part of a command group returning from a high-level briefing, possessed comprehensive knowledge of German defensive positions, artillery placements, and, most critically, the planned response to the upcoming Allied offensive. Maps found in their possession confirmed verbal information, providing Allied planners with unprecedented insight into enemy preparations. Within hours, this intelligence was being analyzed at 5th Army headquarters. General Clark himself reportedly reviewed the information, immediately recognizing its significance. The German forces, it was now confirmed, had concentrated their defenses at the site of the previous river crossing attempt, leaving other potential crossing points more vulnerable than intelligence had previously indicated. With this information, the entire offensive plan was quickly but significantly modified. The main thrust was redirected to exploit the newly identified weaknesses, while diversionary actions were planned to reinforce the German belief that the attack would come at the expected location. Lieutenant Colonel Harrington, who had reluctantly authorized Donati's unorthodox approach, was summoned to a staff meeting where the success of the intelligence operation was discussed. Though the meeting was classified, reports later suggested that Harrington had downplayed Donati's role, describing it merely as fortunate questioning during routine medical treatment. Whether this was to protect the medic or to distance the medical corps from intelligence activities remained unclear. Donati himself was ordered to return to his regular duties with no official acknowledgement of his actions. The entire episode was classified, with all participants sworn to secrecy. Major Wilson, however, made a point of informing Donati privately about the impact of the intelligence. "The offensive has been completely reconfigured, based on what we learned," he told the medic. "G2's projections suggest we may reduce casualties by 60 to 70% by avoiding the heavily defended areas your prisoners identified." "What happens now?" Donati asked. Wilson's expression became guarded. "Officially nothing. This operation never happened. You treated wounded enemy personnel according to standard protocols, nothing more. There will be no commendation, no official recognition." "I didn't do it for recognition," Donati replied honestly. "Good," Wilson said with a grim smile. "Because the army isn't ready to acknowledge that one of its medics just revolutionized battlefield intelligence gathering. The implications are too complicated. Indeed, the implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical advantages gained." Donati's approach raised profound questions about the ethical boundaries of medical practice in wartime. Had he violated medical ethics by using legitimate treatment as an opportunity for intelligence gathering? Or had he simply been observant of a natural phenomenon that occurred during proper medical care? The Geneva Convention protected medical personnel precisely because their role was humanitarian rather than combative. Had Donati's actions endangered that protected status for all medics? These questions would be debated in classified military medical journals for years afterward, though Donati's name was never officially associated with the incident in any public record. What could not be disputed, however, was the impact of the intelligence on the upcoming offensive. On May 11, 1944, the Allied forces launched Operation Diadem, the spring offensive, designed to finally break through the Gustav Line and open the road to Rome. With their plans revised based on the intelligence from Donati's patients, the attacking forces avoided the heavily defended areas where the Germans expected the main thrust and instead concentrated on previously identified weaknesses in the line. The result was a breakthrough that military historians would later describe as the beginning of the end for German forces in Italy. Within 2 weeks, the Gustav Line had been broken. By June 4th, Rome fell to Allied forces, the first Axis capital to be liberated. In the official after-action reports, the success was attributed to superior intelligence leading to tactical adjustments. No mention was made of how that intelligence was obtained or the young medic whose unconventional thinking had made it possible. For the 900 American soldiers whose lives were saved by not assaulting the heavily defended positions originally targeted, positions identified through Donati's morphine trick, the absence of official recognition meant nothing. They were simply grateful to be alive, even if they never knew why. After the breakthrough at the Gustav Line, Macarius Donati continued to serve as a combat medic with the 27th Medical Battalion through the remainder of the Italian campaign. His official record showed nothing extraordinary. Commendations for courage under fire that were common among frontline medics, citations for lives saved through prompt medical action, the routine promotions that came with continued service. What didn't appear in his record was any mention of the 18 German officers or the intelligence coup that had reshaped an entire offensive. As promised, the operation remained classified, with all participants maintaining silence about what had occurred. For Donati, this silence became increasingly difficult as he witnessed the impact of his actions without being able to discuss them. In letters home, heavily censored by military authorities, he could only hint at his experiences. "I've found that observation is the most valuable skill a medic can have," he wrote to his mother in June 1944. "Sometimes, seeing what others miss makes all the difference between life and death." To his father, he was slightly more direct. "I've used what you taught me, Papa, that the mind is the one thing they can't take from you. My thinking saved lives this week, though I can't explain how." As the Allied forces pushed northward through Italy, Donati continued to refine his understanding of battlefield medicine. The morphine dosage observations that had led to his unorthodox intelligence breakthrough became the foundation for more conventional medical innovations. He developed new guidelines for pain management in combat casualties, carefully documenting different responses to varying doses and administration methods. Captain Mercer, recognizing Donati's unique insights, began routing the most challenging cases to him. By late 1944, Donati had been promoted to technician 4th grade, equivalent to a corporal, and given increased responsibilities in the battalion aid station. His approach to casualty treatment, with its emphasis on personalized dosing and careful observation of individual responses, gradually influenced standard practices throughout the 27th Medical Battalion. What remained unspoken was the moral weight Donati carried from his actions at the farmhouse. Though he had provided legitimate medical care and had never forced or tricked information from his patients, he had deliberately created conditions where they would be more likely to speak freely. In quiet moments, he questioned whether he had violated the spirit, if not the letter, of medical ethics. This internal conflict intensified in September 1944 when he treated a seriously wounded German medic. As they communicated in their shared broken medical Latin, Donati felt a profound connection with this enemy counterpart who wore the same Red Cross and faced the same ethical challenges of providing care amid violence. "We are the same, you and I," the German medic said weakly as Donati worked to stabilize him. "We do not kill, we only heal." Donati couldn't bring himself to respond. His silence that day spoke volumes about the complexity of his position and the burden of his secret role in reshaping the offensive months earlier. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Donati had accumulated enough points for discharge and returned to the United States. Like many veterans, he spoke little about his wartime experiences, focusing instead on building a civilian life. Using the GI Bill, he enrolled in medical school at the University of Pennsylvania, where his practical experience gave him an unusual perspective compared to classmates who had never seen combat medicine firsthand. He specialized in anesthesiology, a field where his observations about individualized responses to medication could be applied in a peacetime context. His doctoral dissertation, Variable Response Patterns to Opioid Analgesics, Implications for Personalized Pain Management, drew partly on his wartime observations, though all military references were carefully obscured to maintain security classifications. In 1953, now Dr. Donati established a private practice in Pittsburgh, where he became known for his exceptionally personalized approach to pain management. Patients with complex pain issues were often referred to him as a last resort, and his ability to calibrate treatments to individual physiology earned him professional respect throughout the region. He married Eleanor Sullivan, a nurse he met during his residency in 1954, and they raised 3 children in a comfortable suburban home far removed from the shattered Italian landscape where he had made his most significant contribution to the war effort. To his colleagues and neighbors, he was simply a successful physician with a particular talent for pain management, his wartime service mentioned only in passing, his pivotal role in the Italian campaign never discussed. It wasn't until 1971, as classification periods expired for World War II intelligence operations, that the first hints of Donati's story began to emerge. Major Wilson, by then retired as Colonel Wilson, published a carefully worded article in a military history journal titled Unconventional Intelligence Gathering in the Italian Campaign. Though he never named Donati directly, referring only to an innovative medical corpsman, he outlined how information obtained through observational techniques during routine medical treatment of enemy personnel had critically influenced the May 1944 offensive. The article attracted little attention outside specialized military history circles, but it reached Donati, who by then had largely compartmentalized his wartime experiences. Reading Wilson's account reopened questions he had long set aside about the ethics of what he had done and its implications for medical practice in conflict zones. In 1976, Donati finally broke his long silence, writing a detailed account of the farmhouse incident for the Journal of Military Medicine. The article, Therapeutic Truth, Ethical Considerations in Battlefield Medicine, used the incident as a case study to explore the complex intersection of medical ethics and military necessity. He argued that while medical personnel must maintain their primary commitment to patient welfare, the realities of combat sometimes create situations where the boundaries between care and combat become blurred. The medic in wartime exists in an ethical borderland, he wrote. sworn to heal yet serving a military purpose. This duality creates inevitable tensions that each medical professional must navigate according to their own conscience and the specific circumstances they face. The article generated significant professional discussion, with opinions sharply divided. Some medical ethicists criticized what they saw as a dangerous precedent, arguing that any use of medical treatment for military advantage undermined the protected status of medical personnel and ultimately endangered both medics and patients. Others took a more pragmatic view, suggesting that Donati's approach, providing legitimate care while remaining observant of information freely offered, represented a reasonable compromise in the extreme circumstances of combat. Military historians, meanwhile, began to recognize the significance of the intelligence breakthrough that had facilitated the successful May offensive. As more documents from the period were declassified, the full impact of the information obtained from the 18 German officers became clearer. Tactical analyses suggested that without this intelligence, the offensive might have stalled much as previous attempts had, potentially extending the Italian campaign by months and costing thousands of additional lives. In 1983, nearly 40 years after the events at the Italian farmhouse, Donati received an unexpected letter from the Department of the Army. The letter informed him that a review of classified operations during the Italian campaign had led to a decision to award him the Bronze Star for meritorious service contributing directly to combat success. The citation, carefully worded to avoid security classifications still in effect, recognized his innovative application of medical knowledge, resulting in critical intelligence acquisition without compromise of medical ethics or protocols. The medal arrived by registered mail 2 weeks later, without ceremony or public acknowledgement. Donati placed it in his desk drawer alongside the combat medical badge he had received during the war, viewing both with the complicated emotions of a man who understood that heroism and moral ambiguity often walk hand in hand. That same year, he was invited to speak at a closed symposium at Walter Reed Army Medical Center on ethical challenges in combat medicine. His presentation, attended by military medical personnel preparing for potential Cold War deployments, offered no easy answers, but instead emphasized the importance of ethical reasoning in complex situations. "There is no manual for the moral dimensions of combat medicine," he told the assembled doctors and medics. "There are principles, yes, but their application requires judgment. Your primary obligation is always to the patient before you, but you cannot be blind to the larger context in which you operate. This tension is not a failure of medical ethics, but its most profound test." In the years that followed, as historical distance allowed more objective assessment of wartime actions, Donati's morphine trick gradually found its place in military medical history. Not as a tactic to be replicated, but as a case study in the complex ethical terrain of battlefield medicine. Medical ethics curricula at military medical schools began including discussions of the case, using it to explore the boundaries between treatment and intelligence, between individual patient welfare and collective military necessity. Donati himself continued his medical practice until retirement in 1987, known to his patients as a compassionate physician with an unusual ability to calibrate pain management to individual needs. To all but a few, the connection between Donati's specialized knowledge and the critical intelligence breakthrough of April 1944 remained invisible, one of the countless untold stories of ordinary men and women whose moments of extraordinary judgment shaped the outcome of the Second World War. As he grew older, Donati became increasingly reflective about his wartime experiences. In a private memoir written for his children, but not published until after his death, he addressed the moral complexity of his most significant wartime action. "I have asked myself 1,000 times whether what I did was right," he wrote. "I provided legitimate medical care to wounded men. I observed the effects of proper medication. I listened to what they chose to say. At no point did I violate my duty as a medic to care for the wounded, regardless of uniform. Yet I deliberately used my medical knowledge in a way that served a military purpose beyond healing. Was this a corruption of medicine's healing mission, or a creative application of observation in service of ending the war more quickly? I still don't know." What I do know is that men who would have died lived because of information freely given during medical treatment I provided. In the moral calculus of war, perhaps that is enough. Macarius Donati passed away in October 1997 at the age of 75, his Bronze Star and the fuller story of his wartime innovation known only to a small circle of family, colleagues, and military historians. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned his service as a combat medic in Italy and his contributions to the field of pain management, but said nothing of the 18 German officers or the intelligence that helped break the Gustav Line. Yet the ripples of his actions continued to spread long after his passing. In 2005, the newly established Center for Military Medical Ethics at the Uniformed Services University included the Donati case in its core curriculum, using it to challenge future military medical personnel to consider the ethical dimensions of their dual roles as healers and uniformed service members. In 2011, her comprehensive historical analysis of the Italian campaign explicitly acknowledged for the first time the central role that Donati's unorthodox approach had played in the successful May 1944 offensive. Military historian Robert Atkinson's The Road to Rome: Intelligence and Strategy in the Italian Campaign devoted an entire chapter to what he termed the Morphine revelation, concluding that few, if any, individual actions by non-command personnel had a more significant impact on the strategic direction of the Italian campaign. Today, as military medicine continues to evolve in the context of modern warfare, the questions raised by Donati's innovative approach remain as relevant as ever. Where is the line between observation and exploitation? How do medical personnel balance their obligations to individual patients against the larger mission of the forces they serve? When does pragmatism in saving lives justify stepping into ethical gray areas? These questions have no simple answers, which is perhaps why Donati's story continues to resonate with those who study the complex intersection of medicine, ethics, and warfare. His morphine trick, a moment of inspiration born from careful observation and applied with both compassion and calculation, stands as a testament to the moral complexity that ordinary people face in extraordinary circumstances. What remains undisputed, however, is the impact of that April morning when one medic's unconventional thinking yielded the intelligence that helped break a stalemate and potentially saved hundreds of American lives. In the chaos and moral ambiguity of war, Macarius Donati found a way to fulfill his duty as a healer, while simultaneously serving the larger cause to which he was committed. For the men of the 36th Division who survived the May offensive, men who might otherwise have fallen in a frontal assault against heavily defended positions, the ethical nuances of how the critical intelligence was obtained mattered far less than the simple fact of their survival. They returned home, built lives, raised families, and contributed to their communities in countless ways, all because one medic was willing to think beyond conventional protocols when confronted with an unconventional war. As we reflect on the countless decisions that collectively shaped the outcome of World War II, Donati's story reminds us that history often turns not on the grand strategies of generals, but on the moral courage and innovative thinking of ordinary individuals facing extraordinary challenges. His legacy lives on not just in military medical ethics, but in the broader question he forces us to confront. When faced with impossible choices, how do we balance our professional duties against our human obligation to minimize suffering and save lives? Would you have made the same choice? Would you have seen the opportunity that Donati saw, and having seen it, would you have had the courage to act? In the final analysis, perhaps the true value of his story lies not in providing answers, but in compelling us to wrestle with questions that have no easy resolution, questions that define not just military medicine, but the human experience in times of conflict and crisis.